March 30th, 1896. A bargeman's pole breaks the surface of the Thames near Reading, snagging something that shouldn't be there. The package bobs in the murky water, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, the kind you'd use for a birthday gift or a parcel of books. But as the bargeman pulls it closer, the paper tears. A tiny hand emerges from the opening, fingers curled as if reaching for help that never came. Inside that waterlogged package was the body of a baby girl, no more than a few months old. White tape had been wound tightly around her neck, and a brick had been stuffed into the wrapping to weigh her down. Someone had tried very hard to make sure she stayed hidden beneath the dark waters forever. But the Thames, like all rivers, eventually gives up its secrets. This wasn't the first time. Over the previous months, 7 similar packages had been pulled from this same stretch of water. 7 babies, all strangled, all weighted down, all wrapped like unwanted parcels being returned to sender. The police had been investigating, but leads were scarce in a city of millions where babies disappeared every single day and no one seemed to notice. Victorian London prided itself on progress. This was the age of empire, of gaslight, of scientific advancement and moral superiority. Britain ruled a quarter of the world's population and saw itself as civilization's shining example. Yet beneath the polished veneer of respectability, in the cramped boarding houses and foggy backstreets, a different reality festered. Thousands of babies vanished annually into a shadowy underworld that polite society refused to acknowledge. The package that surfaced that March morning would finally force England to confront what it had been trying to ignore. Because this time, the killer had made a mistake. Wrapped around one of the tiny limbs was a distinctive piece of fabric, and pressed into the brown paper were faint traces of an address. Small clues, but enough for the detectives at Scotland Yard to finally have something to pursue. What they didn't know yet was that they were hunting someone who had been operating in plain sight for decades. Someone who advertised in newspapers, who corresponded with desperate women using her real name, who ran her business from a respectable address. Someone who had turned the murder of infants into the most profitable enterprise of her life. The Victorian age had many monsters, but most wore top hats and carried canes. This one wore a bonnet and called herself a nurse. Her name was Amelia Dyer, and by the time the police knocked on her door, she had already killed more people than Jack the Ripper ever dreamed of. The difference: Jack terrified London for mere months. Amelia operated for 30 years, and society had been paying her to do it. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, where every mystery has a ticking timeline waiting to be uncovered. The bargeman who found that package couldn't have known he'd just discovered the thread that would unravel the most horrifying criminal enterprise in British history. He couldn't have known that beneath the surface of the Thames, weighted down by bricks and hidden in the silt, lay the evidence of hundreds of murders. He simply reported what he'd found and went back to work, trying to forget the feel of that small hand breaking through the paper. But Detective Constable Anderson, the man assigned to investigate, wouldn't forget. He'd been tracking these river murders for weeks, watching the pattern emerge, feeling the sickening certainty that somewhere in London, a killer was disposing of babies as casually as one might throw away rubbish. Now, finally, he had something tangible to follow. The fabric wrapped around the baby's limb was traced to a specific manufacturer. The address markings on the paper, though smudged by water, were just legible enough to identify a district. And there was something else, something the killer hadn't counted on. The tape used to strangle the child bore a manufacturer's mark, and it had only been sold at certain shops in certain neighborhoods. 3 clues: a piece of fabric, a partial address, and distinctive tape. In 1896, before fingerprinting, before DNA, before databases and computers, this was what justice looked like. Patient detective work, door-to-door inquiries, and the slow, methodical process of elimination. Anderson began his investigation in the boarding houses of Reading, that respectable town just west of London, where the Thames had given up its grisly evidence. He was looking for a woman who took in babies, who corresponded with desperate mothers, who promised loving homes for unwanted children. What he would find instead was an industry built on society's shame, and a killer who had transformed maternal desperation into a murder machine. The clock was ticking. Somewhere in England, another mother was writing another letter, Another baby was being handed over to another smiling woman who promised everything. And the Thames, patient and dark, waited for its next small package to arrive. Victorian England worshipped the appearance of virtue. Morality wasn't just practiced, it was performed, displayed in the parlor like fine china, paraded through the streets in crisp Sunday clothes. The empire's power rested not just on military might, but on the conviction that British society represented civilization's pinnacle. Order, decency, Christian values. These were the pillars upon which the greatest empire in history supposedly stood. But empires cast long shadows, and in those shadows, inconvenient truths festered. By the 1890s, London's population had exploded to over 5 million souls, making it the largest city the world had ever seen. The wealthy lived in elegant townhouses with servants and gas lighting, their children dressed in sailor suits and taught by governesses. But the majority existed in conditions that would be unimaginable today. Entire families crammed into single rooms in crumbling tenements. Raw sewage ran through open gutters. Disease was rampant, and death was a constant companion, especially for the very young. In this overcrowded, desperate world, babies were both blessing and curse. For married couples of means, children represented legacy and lineage. But for the unmarried woman, for the servant girl seduced by her employer, for the factory worker abandoned by her lover, pregnancy meant social annihilation. Victorian society showed no mercy to fallen women. A single mistake could destroy a life completely. The unwed mother faced impossible choices. If she kept her child, she'd lose her employment. No respectable household would employ a woman with an illegitimate baby. Without work, she'd end up in the workhouse, that dreaded institution where families were separated and inmates were worked like prisoners. The workhouse wasn't just feared for its brutality. It represented the ultimate social failure, a public admission of moral bankruptcy. Some desperate women tried concealment, giving birth alone in rented rooms, sometimes accidentally smothering their newborns in the chaos and pain of unassisted labor. Others turned to infanticide immediately, driven by panic and desperation. The newspapers of the era are filled with stories of babies found in parks, in rivers, in dustbins, and public toilets. So common were these discoveries that most warranted only a few lines of print, squeezed between advertisements for soap and announcements of society weddings. But there was another option, one that allowed desperate mothers to believe their children might still have a chance at life. They could place an advertisement in the newspapers, or respond to one, seeking someone willing to adopt their baby. And the newspapers of Victorian London were filled with such advertisements, printed in the classified sections alongside notices for housemaids and second-hand furniture. Married couple wishes to adopt healthy infant. Small premium expected. Respectable woman will care for infant. Good home guaranteed. Permanent arrangement preferred. Widow with nursing experience seeks child to raise as her own. References available. These advertisements seemed like lifelines to drowning women. The word premium was code, a one-time payment in exchange for taking the child permanently. The amounts varied, typically between 10 and 50 pounds, a fortune for a working-class woman, but somehow manageable if she sold everything she owned, borrowed from family, or saved desperately from her wages. The key word was permanent. This wasn't boarding or temporary care. This was supposed to be adoption, a final solution that would give the child a home and the mother a chance to rebuild her shattered life. The practice became known as baby farming, and by the 1880s, it had evolved into a thriving underground industry. Thousands of women across Britain made their living taking in unwanted infants. Some were legitimate, genuinely caring for the children they accepted, but many others saw an opportunity that Victorian hypocrisy had created, a chance to profit from society's darkest secret. The economics were brutally simple. A baby farmer could advertise her services, collect premiums from multiple desperate mothers, and then simply let the infants die through deliberate neglect. No need for messy violence, just withhold proper food, keep the children in cold rooms, dose them with laudanum to keep them quiet, and wait. Infant mortality was already catastrophically high in Victorian England. One more dead baby would raise no suspicions. The death certificate would read marasmus, or convulsions, or failure to thrive, and no one would investigate further. The truly ambitious baby farmers refined the process even further. Why wait for nature to take its course when you could speed things along? Strangulation was quick and left minimal evidence. Drowning was reliable. Poisoning with opiates could be passed off as accidental overdose. And disposal was easy in a city where bodies turned up in the Thames so regularly that the river police had seen everything. For 30 years, Amelia Dyer had perfected this system. She understood that Victorian society needed people like her, even if it would never admit it. She provided a service that allowed respectable families to hide their shame, that let servant girls keep their positions, that helped maintain the fiction of British moral superiority. She was both monster and symptom, a product of the very society that would eventually condemn her. The mothers who handed over their babies to Amelia Dyer didn't know they were signing death warrants. They believed the promises of loving homes and proper care. They paid their premiums, kissed their children goodbye, and walked away believing they'd done the best they could in impossible circumstances. Some never inquired about their children again, too afraid to disturb what they hoped was a happy new life. Others sent letters that went unanswered, their anxiety growing but their powerlessness complete. Detective Anderson understood all of this as he began his investigation in 1896. He knew he wasn't just hunting a murderer. He was confronting a system that Victorian England had built and maintained through willful blindness. The babies in the Thames weren't just Amelia Dyer's victims. They were casualties of a society that valued appearance over compassion, reputation over humanity, and silence over justice. Somewhere in the classified sections of London's newspapers, new advertisements were being printed. New mothers were reading them, feeling hope for the first time since discovering their pregnancies. And Amelia Dyer was preparing to answer their letters, her pen steady, her conscience undisturbed. They called themselves nurses, adoption agents, foster mothers, respectable titles for a respectable trade. The women who ran baby farms came from all walks of life. Some were widows seeking income. Others were married women, supplementing their husbands' wages. A few were former midwives or wet nurses who saw an opportunity in the steady stream of unwanted infants flowing through Victorian society. The term baby farmer itself carried no inherent stigma in the 1870s and 1880s. It was simply a descriptor for someone who took in children for payment, much like a dairy farmer took in cows. Society understood that unmarried mothers needed somewhere to place their babies, and baby farmers filled that need. The law even recognized the practice, requiring registration in some jurisdictions, though enforcement was practically non-existent. But beneath this veneer of legitimacy, something far darker had taken root. The business model was devastatingly efficient. A baby farmer would rent a modest house in a respectable neighborhood, nothing too grand to attract attention, nothing too shabby to discourage clients. She'd furnish 1 or 2 rooms nicely for meeting with mothers, places where cribs sat empty and clean blankets were folded neatly on shelves. She'd craft advertisements carefully, using words like loving, comfortable, and Christian home to appeal to desperate women seeking reassurance that they weren't condemning their children to misery. When a mother responded, the baby farmer would arrange a meeting. These encounters followed a predictable script. The baby farmer would present herself as kindly and maternal, often dressed in dark, respectable clothing that suggested widowhood and piety. She'd coo over the infant, remarking on its health and beauty. She'd share fabricated stories about other children she'd successfully placed with loving families. She'd show references, forged or borrowed, attesting to her character. Then came the negotiation. The premium varied based on the mother's apparent means and desperation. A servant girl with limited savings might be charged £10. A middle-class woman trying to hide an affair might pay $50 or more. The baby farmer would explain that this one-time payment covered all expenses permanently: food, clothing, medical care, everything until the child was old enough to work and support itself. It seemed expensive, but compared to years of boarding fees, it was actually economical. More importantly, it was final. The mother could walk away and never look back. Most baby farmers required the mother to sign papers relinquishing all rights to the child. These documents had no legal standing. Victorian adoption law was virtually non-existent, but they served a psychological purpose. They formalized the abandonment, making it official and irrevocable. Many mothers, signing away their children, wept openly. The baby farmers had seen it all before. They offered tea, murmured sympathetic platitudes, and waited patiently for the money to change hands. Once the mother departed, the child's fate was sealed. The legitimate baby farmers would genuinely attempt to place children with families willing to adopt, or would board them until they were old enough for the workhouse or domestic service. These women operated on thin margins, juggling multiple children, struggling to keep them fed and healthy enough to survive. Even with good intentions, their mortality rates were appalling. Overcrowding, poor nutrition, and inadequate medical care meant that babies died with horrifying regularity. But the criminal baby farmers had no intention of keeping children alive. Every day a baby survived was a day that consumed resources, milk, clothing, heating, time. Far more profitable to collect the premium and eliminate the overhead as quickly as possible. Some used a method called slow murder, deliberately starving infants while dosing them with laudanum and gin to keep them docile. The children would waste away over weeks, their death certificates citing natural causes that no doctor would question. Others were more direct. Amelia Dyer belonged to this category. She had learned her trade in the 1860s, working as a nurse and midwife in Bristol. She'd seen firsthand the desperation of unmarried mothers, the shame that drove women to the brink of suicide, the babies born in secret and hidden away like guilty secrets. She'd also seen how much money changed hands in these transactions, and her entrepreneurial mind had identified an opportunity. Dyer's early career as a baby farmer was semi-legitimate. She took in infants, collected premiums, and made some effort to care for them, though her standards were low and her mortality rates high. But she quickly realized that keeping children alive wasn't profitable. The premium was fixed, but expenses continued indefinitely. The mathematics were undeniable. Dead babies were more lucrative than living ones. So she refined her method. Strangulation with white edging tape became her signature. The tape was strong, readily available, and left clear marks that could be explained away as the result of rough swaddling or the child pulling at its own clothing in distress. She would wrap the tape around an infant's neck, pull tight, and hold until the struggling stopped. Death came quickly, usually within minutes. Then came disposal. The Thames for babies in the Reading area, shallow graves in rented garden plots, or simply wrapping the body in paper and leaving it in a public place where someone else would deal with it. Between murders, Dyer lived a seemingly normal life. She attended church. She paid her rent on time. She wore respectable clothing and spoke in soft, educated tones. Neighbors saw her as a kindly nurse who helped unfortunate women. When babies cried in her house, no one thought it unusual. She was a baby farmer after all. When the crying stopped, no one noticed. Other baby farmers operated similarly across London and throughout Britain. Margaret Waters, executed in 1870 for infant murder, had kept children in such appalling conditions that those who didn't die from neglect begged for death through their constant screaming. Annie Took, arrested in 1879, had buried 11 babies in her garden, collecting premiums on each one. Charlotte Windsor had thrown infants off bridges, weighted with stones, their small bodies tumbling through darkness into cold water below. These women became known, in whispered conversations, as angel makers, a darkly ironic term for those who sent babies to heaven before they'd lived long enough to know earth. Some claimed they were performing a mercy, saving children from the workhouse or a life of poverty and shame. Others showed no remorse whatsoever, viewing their victims as products in a transaction rather than human beings. The law struggled to respond. When baby farmers were caught, prosecutions were difficult. Proving murder required evidence, and evidence was scarce when babies died of natural causes and were buried quickly. Even when convictions were secured, sentences were often light. A few months in prison, a small fine. Society's ambivalence about illegitimate children undermined efforts at justice. These babies weren't wanted in life. Why make a fuss about them in death? But by 1896, public opinion was beginning to shift. Newspapers had started covering baby farming cases more aggressively, and reform movements were demanding legal changes. The tide was slowly turning against the angel makers, though thousands of children had already been sacrificed to Victorian hypocrisy. Detective Anderson knew all of this history as he traced the evidence from the Thames baby back toward its source. He knew he was hunting not just one woman, but confronting an entire system of murder. And he knew that even if he caught Amelia Dyer, hundreds of other baby farmers would continue operating in the shadows, collecting premiums and disposing of innocents. The house at 276 Piggott Road in Reading was waiting. Inside, Amelia Dyer was answering letters from desperate mothers, arranging meetings, negotiating premiums. She had no idea that the Thames had betrayed her, that the police were coming, that her 30-year career was about to end. Amelia Elizabeth Hobley was born in 1837 in the village of Pile Marsh, Bristol, into a world that seemed destined to shape her into something monstrous. Her childhood was marked by tragedy and dysfunction. Her mother suffered from severe mental illness, spiraling into madness that required constant supervision. Young Amelia watched her mother's descent with a mixture of horror and fascination, learning early that the human mind was fragile, that suffering was ordinary, and that society had little patience for those who couldn't maintain appearances. She was educated beyond her class, unusual for a working-class girl in the 1840s. She could read and write eloquently, skills that would later prove invaluable in crafting advertisements and corresponding with victims. At 14, she was apprenticed to a corset maker, but the work was brutally physical and poorly paid. Amelia wanted more. She craved respectability, financial security, and escape from the grinding poverty that defined working-class existence. At age 22, she trained as a nurse, one of the few respectable professions open to women. This was before Florence Nightingale had fully reformed nursing into a respected medical profession. Nurses in the 1860s were often viewed as little better than servants, but they had access to the intimate spaces of birth and death, to the secret shames of families, to opportunities that others never saw. Amelia married George Thomas in 1861. He was significantly older, and the marriage seemed motivated more by practical necessity than passion. Together they moved to Bristol, where Amelia established herself as a midwife and nurse. This was her introduction to the world of illegitimate births and desperate mothers. She attended women laboring in secret, helped them through deliveries they couldn't acknowledge, and witnessed firsthand the terror in their eyes as they begged her to take their babies away. She saw the money that changed hands. She saw how much these women would pay to make their problems disappear. And she realized that Victorian morality had created a perfect business opportunity for anyone ruthless enough to seize it. By the late 1860s, Amelia had transitioned fully into baby farming. She placed advertisements in newspapers, offering adoption services for premiums. Initially, she may have made genuine efforts to place some children, but the financial pressures were constant. Her husband's income was irregular, and maintaining even a modest household required steady money. Dead babies required no ongoing expenses. The logic was simple, even if the morality was unconscionable. Her first confirmed murders likely occurred in the early 1870s, though the exact number will never be known. She developed her signature method: white tape wound around tiny necks, pressure applied until life ceased. She became efficient at disposal, learning which locations drew less attention, which times of day offered better cover. She learned to forge death certificates, claiming babies had died of marasmus or convulsions, conditions so common that no one questioned them. In 1872, a doctor became suspicious about the high mortality rate of infants in Amelia's care and reported her to authorities. She was arrested and charged with negligence, though not murder. The evidence was insufficient for the more serious charge. She spent 6 months in prison, a sentence that should have ended her career. Instead, it merely forced her to become more careful. Upon release, she changed her methods slightly. She moved to different locations more frequently, used different names in her advertisements, and established a network of aliases and temporary addresses. She also began suffering from what she claimed were nervous disorders, bouts of depression and anxiety that may have been genuine mental illness or convenient excuses when authorities came calling. She was committed to mental asylums several times, each stay providing her with the ready explanation for any gaps in her history or inconsistencies in her story. Her husband George died in 1869, and Amelia remarried in 1879 to a man named William Dyer. He was either genuinely unaware of her activities or deliberately blind to them. He worked as a laborer and seems to have asked few questions about where the money came from or why babies arrived at their home and quickly disappeared. Their daughter, Polly, eventually became complicit in the murders, helping her mother with correspondence and sometimes with disposal of bodies. By the 1890s, Amelia Dyer had been killing babies for nearly 30 years. She had refined her operation to industrial efficiency. She would rent a house under a false name, place advertisements in multiple newspapers simultaneously, arrange meetings with mothers, collect premiums, murder the infants within hours of receiving them, and dispose of the bodies before anyone could connect her to the deaths. She moved frequently, Reading, London, Cardiff, Bristol, staying in each location only long enough to complete several transactions before vanishing. Her advertisements were masterpieces of manipulation. Married couple with no family would adopt healthy child. Nice country home. Terms, £15. The promise of a married couple suggested stability. The mention of a country home implied fresh air and wholesome living. The specific premium amount conveyed businesslike legitimacy. Every word was calculated to inspire confidence in desperate women who wanted to believe their children would be loved. The letters she wrote to inquiring mothers were equally crafted. She used elegant handwriting, proper grammar, and warm maternal language. She spoke of her love for children, her comfortable circumstances, her Christian faith. She provided references, usually forgeries or names of people who had moved away and couldn't be contacted. She sent photographs of herself looking respectable and kind, wearing dark dresses and cameo brooches that suggested genteel widowhood. When mothers arrived to hand over their children, Amelia played her role perfectly. She was warm but not effusive, practical but compassionate. She would hold the baby tenderly, remark on its beauty, and assure the mother that the child would want for nothing. She collected the premium, counted it carefully, and provided a receipt if requested. She watched mothers weep as they kissed their babies goodbye, and she offered tea and sympathy. Then, once they were gone, she would strangle the child and begin planning its disposal. The psychology required to do this repeatedly for 3 decades is almost incomprehensible. Amelia showed no signs of the frenzied madness often associated with serial killers. She was methodical, organized, and coldly rational. She kept detailed records of correspondence, noting which mothers had paid and which might be contacted for additional funds. She maintained a respectable public persona, attending church and engaging politely with neighbors. She compartmentalized completely, separating her identity as a killer from her identity as a respectable widow. Some historians have suggested she suffered from a form of sociopathy, an inability to recognize the humanity of her victims. Others have pointed to her difficult childhood and exposure to maternal mental illness as formative trauma. Still others argue she was simply evil, a woman who chose profit over morality again and again until murder became routine. By early 1896, Amelia was living at 276 Piggott Road in Reading with her son-in-law Arthur Palmer, who had married Polly and become another member of the family business. The house was modest but respectable, located on a quiet street where neighbors minded their own affairs. Inside, Amelia continued her correspondence with mothers, arranging meetings, collecting premiums, and committing murders with the casual efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. She had no way of knowing that the Thames had betrayed her, that the body she'd weighted and wrapped so carefully had surfaced, that Detective Anderson was tracing evidence back to her door. She felt safe in her routine, confident that society's willful blindness would continue protecting her as it had for 30 years. She was wrong. The clock had run out. Justice, delayed for decades, was finally coming for Amelia Dyer. The Thames had been giving up bodies for weeks before anyone recognized the pattern. Rivers in Victorian England regularly surrendered their dead, suicides, accident victims, the homeless who fell in while drunk, criminals disposed of by rival gangs. One more corpse floating past the embankments was hardly newsworthy. But these bodies were different. These were babies. The first discovery came in early January 1896, when a lockkeeper near Caversham found a parcel bobbing against the weir. Inside was an infant, perhaps 4 months old, strangled with white tape. The coroner recorded a verdict of murder by person or persons unknown. The body was buried in a pauper's grave, and the investigation went nowhere. There were no missing persons reports. Illegitimate babies weren't reported missing. There were no frantic parents searching for lost children. The dead infant had no name, no identity, no one to mourn. 3 weeks later, another package surfaced near Reading Bridge. Same method, white tape around the neck, brown paper wrapping, a brick for weight. This time the body was fresher, suggesting recent disposal. The local police began to wonder if they had a serial killer operating in their jurisdiction, but with no leads and no witnesses, the case stalled. Then the discoveries accelerated. February brought 2 more bodies, both infants, both strangled, both found in the same stretch of river between Reading and Henley. March produced 3 more. By the time the bargeman found the body on March 30th, Detective Anderson had been assigned to the case full-time, and he knew with absolute certainty that these weren't random murders. This was systematic disposal. Someone was killing babies with industrial efficiency and using the Thames as their dumping ground. Anderson was 42 years old, a veteran of the Thames Valley Police with 20 years of experience. He'd investigated murders, thefts, assaults, and every category of crime that Victorian society produced. But this case disturbed him more deeply than anything he'd encountered. The victims were infants, helpless and innocent. The killer was methodical and organized. And most troubling of all, the murders appeared to have been going on for far longer than the recent discovery suggested. He began by examining every detail of the recovered bodies. The white tape was consistent across all victims, the same type, the same knots, the same placement around the neck. The wrapping paper varied slightly, but all bore similar characteristics. Brown parcel paper available at any stationer, tied with common string. The bricks used for weight were ordinary building bricks, impossible to trace. The killer was careful, using materials so generic that they provided no obvious leads. But the body from March 30th was different. This one had been in the water for less time, and decomposition hadn't yet destroyed all the evidence. Wrapped around the baby's left arm was a piece of fabric, a remnant of a distinctive carpet bag, made from a patterned material that wasn't mass-produced. Anderson carefully preserved this fragment, intuiting that it might be the break he needed. More importantly, the brown paper wrapping bore faint traces of an address. Water had smudged the ink almost beyond legibility, but under magnification, Anderson could make out partial letters. Mrs. Thomas, and what appeared to be Piggott, or possibly Diggott. The location was harder to determine, but he thought he could distinguish Read, which might be Reading. It wasn't much, but it was something. Anderson began the painstaking work of tracking down every Mrs. Thomas in Reading who lived on a street that might match the partial address. There were dozens of possibilities. He and his team went door to door, showing the fabric fragment, asking about baby farming activities, inquiring about women who took in infants for adoption. Most doors closed quickly. Baby farming occupied a gray zone in Victorian morality. Everyone knew it happened, but discussing it was unseemly. Respectable people didn't acknowledge such things, even when asked directly by police. Anderson encountered wall after wall of silence, polite denials, and redirections to other neighborhoods, where that sort of thing supposedly occurred. Meanwhile, the Thames continued surrendering its dead. 2 more babies were found in early April, bringing the total to 13 recovered bodies. Anderson knew these were only the ones that had surfaced. How many more remained hidden in the river's depths, trapped in weeds or buried in silt? How long had this been going on? Weeks? Months? Years? The pressure on Anderson intensified. Newspapers had picked up the story, running sensational headlines about the Thames mystery and the baby killer of Reading. The public was horrified and fascinated in equal measure. Letters poured into police stations demanding action. Members of Parliament raised questions about why the killer hadn't been caught. Anderson's superiors wanted results, and they wanted them quickly. The break came from an unexpected source. A shopkeeper in Reading who sold stationery and packing materials remembered a woman who had purchased brown parcel paper and string on multiple occasions. She was older, perhaps in her 50s, respectably dressed, and always polite. She'd mentioned once that she sent packages to family members regularly. The shopkeeper couldn't remember her name, but he recalled she'd asked about the best way to wrap items for posting by river barge, an odd question that had stuck in his memory. River barge. That detail electrified Anderson. Most people sent parcels by train or mail coach. Why would someone specifically ask about river transport, unless they were planning to put something in the river? The shopkeeper provided a description. A stout woman with graying hair, wearing dark clothing, often carrying a carpet bag. Anderson showed him the fabric fragment recovered from the body. The shopkeeper's eyes widened. He recognized the pattern. It matched a carpet bag he'd seen the woman carrying. Now Anderson had a description and a method. He intensified his door-to-door canvass, specifically seeking anyone matching the shopkeeper's description. He also began checking records of recent house rentals and reasoning that someone disposing of bodies in the Thames might not want to stay in one location too long. On April 3rd, Anderson received information about a woman calling herself Mrs. Thomas, who had recently rented a house on Piggott Road. The landlord described her as quiet and respectable, though he'd noticed an unusual amount of traffic. Women arriving with bundles, staying briefly, then leaving without them. He'd assumed she ran some sort of domestic service agency. He'd never investigated further because the rent was always paid on time. Piggott Road. Mrs. Thomas. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Anderson obtained a warrant and assembled a team. They would raid 276, Piggott Road at dawn on April 4th, hoping to catch the occupants before they had time to destroy evidence or flee. As Anderson prepared for the raid, he felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. If this was indeed the killer's residence, what would they find inside? How many babies had passed through that house? How many mothers had handed over their children, believing they were securing better futures, never knowing they were signing death warrants? The Thames had revealed enough to point the way. Now it was time to see what horrors the house on Piggott Road concealed. Anderson checked his pocket watch. 4 hours until dawn. 4 hours until they would finally confront the monster who had been turning the river into a graveyard for innocents. Somewhere in that house, Amelia Dyer was sleeping peacefully, unaware that her carefully constructed world was about to collapse. The angel maker was about to meet her reckoning. Dawn broke cold and gray over reading on April 4th, 1896. Detective Anderson and his team gathered 2 streets away from Piggott Road, checking their preparations one final time. 6 constables, 2 detectives, and Anderson himself. A small army preparing to raid a house occupied by what appeared to be a middle-aged woman and her family. The precaution seemed excessive until you remembered what they were investigating. 13 dead babies pulled from the Thames. Possibly dozens more never recovered. This wasn't a simple arrest. This was the culmination of months of detective work and decades of murder. Anderson had barely slept. His mind churned with possibilities and concerns. What if Mrs. Thomas wasn't the killer? What if this was another dead end in a case that seemed to multiply questions faster than it produced answers? What if they raided the house and found nothing incriminating, alerting the real killer that police were closing in? But the evidence, circumstantial as it was, all pointed to 276, Piggott Road. The parcel address on the brown paper, the fabric fragment matching the carpet bag, the shopkeeper's identification, the landlord's description of women arriving with bundles. At precisely 6 o'clock in the morning, the team moved into position. Anderson approached the front door while constables covered the rear exit and side windows. The street was silent, respectable houses with drawn curtains. No one yet awake to witness the drama about to unfold. Anderson raised his hand and knocked firmly. No response. He knocked again, harder this time, his knuckles striking wood with authority that echoed down the quiet street. Finally, movement inside, shuffling footsteps, the sound of locks being turned. The door opened a crack, and a woman's face appeared, squinting against the morning light. She was stout, graying, wearing a nightdress with a shawl pulled over her shoulders. Her expression showed annoyance rather than fear, the look of someone disturbed during their morning routine rather than someone caught in the act of crimes. "Mrs. Thomas?" Anderson asked, though he already knew the answer. "Mrs. Dyer, actually." The woman corrected him, her voice steady. "Thomas is my maiden name. What's this about?" Anderson produced his warrant. "Thames Valley Police. We have reason to believe evidence connected to several murders may be present on these premises. We're executing a search warrant." For just a moment, something flickered across Amelia Dyer's face. Not fear exactly, but calculation. the rapid mental assessment of someone weighing options. Then her expression smoothed into confusion and concern. Murders? Officers, there must be some mistake. I'm a respectable widow. I run a nursing service for unfortunate mothers. Surely someone has given you incorrect information. Anderson pushed past her into the house. The constables followed, fanning out to search different rooms. Amelia stood in the hallway, clutching her shawl, maintaining her performance of innocent bewilderment. But Anderson noticed her hands trembling slightly, noticed how her eyes darted toward the staircase leading upstairs. The house was surprisingly ordinary. The front parlor was furnished modestly but cleanly, with an upright piano and religious prints on the walls. A crucifix hung above the fireplace. The dining room held a simple table and chairs, dishes stacked neatly in a sideboard. Everything suggested respectable poverty, the home of someone living carefully within limited means. But as the search progressed, the facade began to crack. In a bedroom upstairs, constables found stacks of brown parcel paper, balls of string, and spools of white edging tape, the same type used to strangle the Thames babies. They found carpet bags, one with fabric torn away that matched the fragment Anderson had preserved from the crime scene. They found baby clothes, dozens of tiny garments in various sizes, far more than any legitimate nursing operation would require. More damning were the documents. Amelia kept meticulous records, a habit that would prove her undoing. The police discovered boxes of letters from desperate mothers, arranged chronologically and annotated with notes about premiums paid and arrangements made. They found receipts in various names, showing payments received for adoption services. They found pawn tickets for baby clothes and jewelry, items mothers had sent for their children that Amelia had immediately sold. Most chilling were the telegrams and letters indicating recent transactions. One letter, dated just 3 days earlier, came from a woman in Cheltenham thanking Mrs. Thomas for agreeing to provide a loving home for her daughter. The mother had written, "I know she will be happy with you. The premium of £15 is enclosed. Please send word when she is settled." The £15 was documented in Amelia's records, but there was no baby in the house, no indication of any child being cared for. Where was the daughter from Cheltenham? Anderson confronted Amelia with the evidence. She maintained her composure initially, claiming the letters were part of her legitimate nursing business, that the supplies were simply stock for her work, that she could explain everything. But as more evidence emerged, her explanations became increasingly implausible. A constable searching the garden made a discovery that shattered any remaining pretense of innocence. Buried in a shallow hole beneath rose bushes were items of clothing and fabric scraps that matched materials described in letters from mothers. More importantly, he found lead weights and bricks similar to those used to sink the Thames babies. The garden hadn't been dug recently, suggesting Amelia had used this disposal method for some time before switching to the river. Anderson ordered the cellar searched. There, wrapped in old newspapers and stuffed behind a loose brick, they found more white tape, already cut into lengths, murder weapons prepared in advance, ready for the next victim. They found bottles of laudanum, likely used to sedate babies before killing them. They found packing materials and a handcart that would have been perfect for transporting wrapped bodies to the riverbank under cover of darkness. By noon, the evidence was overwhelming. But Anderson needed more than circumstantial proof. He needed either bodies or witnesses or a confession. The Thames babies proved murder had occurred, but connecting them definitively to Amelia Dyer required establishing that she had possessed specific victims. The breakthrough came from the letters. Anderson cross-referenced the correspondence with missing persons inquiries filed in various jurisdictions. One letter stood out, from a barmaid named Evelina Marmon in Cheltenham, seeking adoption for her daughter Doris. The dates matched the most recently recovered body from the Thames. Evelina had paid a £15 premium on March 31st and delivered baby Doris to a woman calling herself Mrs. Harding at the train station. Anderson sent a constable to Cheltenham to bring Evelina Marmon to Reading. When she arrived and was shown into an identification room where Amelia sat, the young mother gasped audibly, "That's her. That's Mrs. Harding. Where's my Doris? Where's my baby?" Amelia's face remained impassive, but something in her eyes had changed. She knew the game was over. Anderson informed her she was under arrest for the murder of Doris Marmon and multiple other infants. As constables placed her in handcuffs, Amelia finally spoke, her voice quiet and matter-of-fact. "You'll find what you're looking for in the Thames. I used the white tape. It was quick. They didn't suffer long." The confession was chilling in its casualness, as if she were describing a household chore rather than mass murder. Anderson felt his stomach turn, but he kept his expression professional. He had her. After months of investigation, after 13 bodies pulled from the river, after countless dead ends and frustrations, he finally had the killer. As they led Amelia Dyer from the house to the waiting police wagon, neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion. They stared in disbelief at the respectable widow being taken away in chains. How could someone who attended church, who smiled politely when passing on the street, who seemed so utterly ordinary, be capable of such monstrous acts? That was the most disturbing truth Anderson had learned in his years as a detective. Monsters didn't always look monstrous. Sometimes they looked like anyone else, hiding their darkness behind pleasant smiles and respectable clothing. Amelia Dyer had counted on that camouflage for 30 years, and it had worked perfectly until the Thames betrayed her secrets. The house on Piggott Road stood silent as the police wagon pulled away, its windows like dead eyes staring at the street. Inside, evidence of hundreds of murders waited to be catalogued. The full scope of Amelia Dyer's crimes was only beginning to emerge, and what they would ultimately discover would horrify all of England. For 3 days after Amelia Dyer's arrest, police methodically dismantled the house on Piggott Road, searching for evidence that would reveal the full scope of her crimes. What they discovered transformed a murder investigation into something far more horrifying, a decades-long killing spree that dwarfed anything in British criminal history. The scale of the operation became clear as detectives sorted through the correspondence. In boxes and drawers throughout the house, they found over 300 letters from mothers spanning 15 years. 300 desperate women who had trusted Amelia Dyer with their babies. 300 premiums paid. 300 infants handed over with kisses and tears and prayers that they would find better lives. Not all of those babies were dead. Some letters dated back years, and it was possible Amelia had operated semi-legitimately in earlier periods. But the letters from the past 2 years alone numbered over 100, and police could account for perhaps a dozen children who might still be alive, placed with families or in workhouses. The mathematics were damning. At least 80 babies had vanished without trace in just the previous 24 months. The police brought in experts to analyze the evidence. Handwriting specialists confirmed that letters sent to mothers under various names, Mrs. Thomas, Mrs. Harding, Mrs. Stanfield, were all written by the same person. The variations in signature were deliberate disguise, not different correspondence. Amelia had been running multiple parallel schemes simultaneously, maintaining different identities to avoid detection and maximize her income. Financial records revealed the profitability of her enterprise. Premiums ranged from 10 to 50 pounds, with most clustering around 15. In 1895 alone, her documented income from baby farming exceeded 800 pounds, a fortune when the average working-class family survived on less than 60 pounds annually. Amelia Dyer had been wealthy by the standards of her class, all of it earned through murder. The house itself told stories that no documents could capture. In the attic, investigators found a trunk containing baby clothes arranged by size, a grotesque inventory of victims. Each outfit represented a child who had worn it briefly before being murdered. Some items showed signs of wear, suggesting Amelia had kept babies alive for days or weeks before killing them. Others appeared unworn, indicating the child had been murdered almost immediately upon arrival. Behind a false panel in the bedroom closet, police discovered a cache of jewelry and keepsakes, lockets, rings, brooches, small silver items. These were treasures mothers had sent for their children, family heirlooms meant to connect babies to their heritage. Amelia had kept them all, occasionally pawning pieces when she needed quick cash. Each item was tagged with a name and date in Amelia's methodical handwriting, creating an inadvertent memorial to her victims. The cellar revealed evidence of earlier disposal methods. Before switching to the Thames, Amelia had buried bodies in the garden and beneath the cellar floor. A forensic examination uncovered disturbed earth in multiple locations. Excavation produced fragments of infant remains, bones small as bird skeletons, fabric scraps, and more lengths of white tape. The coroner estimated at least 6 bodies had been buried on the premises, though decomposition made precise counting impossible. Perhaps most disturbing were the materials that showed Amelia's evolving methodology. Early letters from the 1870s showed her offering long-term boarding arrangements, suggesting she once kept children alive for extended periods. By the 1880s, her correspondence had shifted to emphasizing permanent adoption, indicating she'd moved away from boarding toward immediate disposal. The most recent letters were brutally efficient, brief negotiations, quick meetings, immediate payment, no follow-up communication. She had refined murder into a business model, optimizing for profit and minimizing risk with each iteration. The white tape method was faster than starvation. The Thames disposal was safer than burial. The multiple identities prevented any single pattern from emerging. She had treated infanticide the way a factory owner might treat manufacturing, seeking efficiencies and economies of scale. Detective Anderson interviewed Amelia's family members, hoping to understand how such extensive criminal activity had remained hidden from those closest to her. Her daughter Polly Palmer initially claimed ignorance, but evidence suggested otherwise. Letters in Polly's handwriting had been sent to several mothers, and neighbors reported seeing Polly help carry wrapped parcels from the house at odd hours. Polly eventually admitted to knowing her mother killed babies, but claimed she'd been too frightened to report it. She was arrested as an accessory. Amelia's son-in-law Arthur Palmer presented a more complicated picture. He worked long hours as a laborer and claimed he'd rarely been home, assuming the babies who briefly appeared in the house were part of his mother-in-law's legitimate nursing work. Police found no direct evidence of his involvement, though his willful ignorance strained credibility. How could he live in a house where babies constantly arrived and never left, where his wife and mother-in-law wrapped mysterious parcels in the middle of the night, and never questioned what was happening? The answer lay in Victorian society's capacity for deliberate blindness. Baby farming occupied a moral gray zone that most people preferred not to examine too closely. Asking questions meant confronting uncomfortable truths about illegitimacy, about poverty, about the desperation that drove women to give up their children. Easier to look away, to assume someone else was handling the problem, to trust that respectable-seeming people were behaving respectably. As evidence mounted, police began the grim task of trying to identify victims. They contacted mothers whose letters appeared in Amelia's collection, asking them to come forward. The responses ranged from denial. Some women refused to believe their children were dead, to devastation. Evelina Marmon, who had identified her baby Doris, collapsed during her second interview and had to be sedated. Other mothers simply stopped responding, unable or unwilling to face the truth. Many victims would never be identified. The Thames babies had decomposed beyond recognition, and many mothers had left no records when handing over their children. Some had given false names, too ashamed to reveal their real identities, even in correspondence with an adoption agent. Others had moved on, deliberately forgetting the children they'd abandoned, building new lives that couldn't accommodate the knowledge that they'd paid someone to commit murder. The investigation expanded beyond reading as police realized Amelia had operated in multiple locations. Records showed addresses in Bristol, Cardiff, and London. Each location required new searches, new excavations, new attempts to quantify the dead. In Bristol, police dredged a section of the River Avon where witnesses reported seeing Amelia dispose of packages. They recovered 3 more infant bodies, all strangled with white tape. The final toll would never be definitively established. At her arrest, Amelia Dyer initially confessed to dozens of murders, but refused to provide exact numbers. Later, she recanted, claiming temporary insanity had caused her to confess falsely. Then she confessed again, this time claiming divine inspiration had driven her actions. Her stories shifted constantly, mixing truth with delusion, making it impossible to separate fact from fabrication. Modern estimates, based on the correspondence recovered and bodies found, suggest Amelia Dyer murdered between 200 and 400 infants over a 30-year career. The range is wide because documentation is incomplete and many bodies were never recovered. But even the conservative estimate of 200 makes her Britain's most prolific serial killer, far exceeding any other murderer in the nation's history. Inside 276, Piggott Road, as police cataloged the last pieces of evidence, the full horror of what had occurred in that ordinary house became inescapable. Behind the respectable facade, behind the crucifix and the piano and the neat dining room, a killing machine had operated with industrial efficiency. Babies had been strangled in bedrooms, while neighbors slept next door. Bodies had been wrapped in the kitchen, carried through the hallway, stored in the cellar until darkness allowed for disposal. The house was eventually demolished, torn down by a landlord who couldn't find tenants willing to live where such atrocities had occurred. But before its destruction, thousands of people came to stare at it, drawn by morbid curiosity to see where the angel maker had worked. They stood on the street, pointing at windows, imagining the horrors that had unfolded inside, trying to reconcile the ordinary appearance with the extraordinary evil it had concealed. Detective Anderson stood among the ruins of the investigation, surrounded by evidence boxes and reports, and felt a profound exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical labor. He had solved the case, arrested the killer, and gathered enough evidence to ensure conviction. But the victory felt hollow. No amount of justice could resurrect the dead or undo the suffering Amelia Dyer had inflicted. The babies were gone. The mothers would carry their guilt and grief forever. And somewhere in England, other baby farmers were still operating, reading about Amelia's arrest and calculating whether they needed to change their methods or simply relocate. The house on Piggott Road was empty now, but the echoes of what had happened there would reverberate through British society for years to come. The trial was yet to come. The reckoning was just beginning. On May 21st, 1896, Amelia Dyer stood in the dock at the Old Bailey, Britain's most famous criminal court. The building itself was designed to inspire awe and terror. Soaring ceilings, dark wood paneling, and the weight of centuries of justice pressing down on all who entered. For over 700 years, this court had judged England's criminals, and now it would judge the woman newspapers were calling the ogress of reading and the baby farm murderess. The public gallery was packed beyond capacity. Hundreds had queued overnight for seats, and thousands more were turned away at the doors. This wasn't merely a trial, it was a spectacle, a theatrical performance of justice that allowed Victorian society to confront its own hypocrisy while maintaining moral distance. The people filling those galleries weren't so different from Amelia Dyer. Many had turned blind eyes to illegitimate pregnancies in their own families. Many had heard whispers about baby farmers and chosen not to investigate. But now they could judge her, condemn her, and feel righteous in doing so. Amelia entered the courtroom looking far older than her 57 years. Imprisonment had aged her visibly. Her hair had gone completely white. Her face was haggard, and she moved with the shuffling gait of someone much more elderly. She wore a black dress with a white collar, an outfit calculated to present her as respectable and harmless. Her defense attorney had advised her on appearance, understanding that juries responded to visual cues as much as evidence. The prosecution was led by Sir Charles Matthews, one of the most formidable legal minds in England. His strategy was straightforward: establish that Amelia had taken babies in exchange for money, prove that those babies had died by violence, and demonstrate that she had profited from their deaths. The law didn't require proving every murder. A conviction for even one would result in execution. Matthews chose to focus on Doris Marman, the Cheltenham baby, because the evidence was strongest and the timeline was clearest. Evelina Marman was the prosecution's first witness. She took the stand trembling, barely able to speak above a whisper. Matthews gently guided her through her testimony. She described her situation: unmarried, pregnant, terrified of losing her position as a barmaid. She explained how she'd found Amelia's advertisement promising a comfortable home for her baby. She recounted the correspondence, the arrangement to meet at the train station, the £15 premium she'd saved by selling everything she owned. And when you handed your baby to the defendant, Matthews asked, "What did she say to you?" Evelina's voice broke. She said Doris was beautiful. She said she would love her like her own. She promised me Doris would never want for anything. And did you believe her? I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her. I had no other choice. The courtroom was silent as Evelina wept. Even the judge looked moved. Matthews let the moment breathe. allowing the jury to absorb the full emotional weight of a mother's desperation and the killer's manipulation. The defense attorney, Arthur Gearing, faced an impossible task. The evidence was overwhelming, and public opinion had already convicted his client. His only viable strategy was to argue insanity, that Amelia had been suffering from mental illness that prevented her from understanding the wrongfulness of her actions. He called witnesses who testified about her previous commitments to mental asylums, her history of depression, and her mother's severe mental illness. A doctor testified that Amelia showed signs of moral insanity, a Victorian-era diagnosis that suggested a person could understand right from wrong intellectually while being compulsively driven to commit immoral acts. The theory was controversial then and is now considered pseudoscience, but it represented one of the few defensive options available. Under cross-examination, however, the insanity defense crumbled. Sir Charles Matthews demonstrated that Amelia's behavior showed clear evidence of rational planning and calculated deception. She had maintained multiple aliases, kept detailed financial records, and adapted her methods to avoid detection. She had operated successfully for 30 years, suggesting sustained competence rather than mental illness. If the defendant was insane, Matthews asked the doctor, how do you explain her meticulous record-keeping? How do you explain her ability to maintain multiple identities simultaneously? How do you explain her success in evading detection for 3 decades? The doctor had no satisfactory answer. Amelia wasn't insane in any meaningful legal sense. She was simply evil, though Victorian law had difficulty accommodating that distinction. The most dramatic moment came when Amelia herself took the stand. Gearing had advised against it, but Amelia insisted, believing she could convince the jury of her innocence, or at least her diminished responsibility. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Matthews approached her with the demeanor of a predator circling wounded prey. He held up items of baby clothing recovered from her house, asking her to identify them. He read letters from desperate mothers, forcing her to acknowledge she'd written the responses. He presented the white tape, the packing materials, the evidence from the Thames. Mrs. Dyer, how many babies did you kill? I don't remember. I was ill. I wasn't myself. You weren't yourself for 30 years. I suffered from my nerves. I had terrible depression. Did your depression prevent you from collecting premiums? Did it prevent you from maintaining detailed financial records? Amelia's composure began to crack. She shifted between different defenses, claiming insanity, then asserting innocence, then suggesting the babies had died of natural causes. Her inconsistency was damning. Juries might forgive mental illness, but they couldn't forgive transparent dishonesty. Matthews produced the letter Amelia had written to Evelina Marmon, promising to love baby Doris, like my own. He asked her to read it aloud to the court. As she did, her voice faltered. The contrast between the warm maternal language of the letter and the cold brutality of what she'd actually done was impossible to ignore. Did you love Doris Marmon? Matthews asked. Silence. Did you strangle her with tape within hours of receiving her? Silence. Did you wrap her body in brown paper, weight it with a brick, and throw her in the Thames? Amelia looked down at her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. I used the tape because it was quick. They didn't suffer long. The courtroom erupted. The judge called for order, pounding his gavel repeatedly. Amelia had just confessed to murder in open court, undermining her entire defense. Gearing sat with his head in his hands, knowing the case was lost. The prosecution called additional witnesses, police officers who described the evidence recovered from Piggott Road, medical examiners who testified about the cause of death for the Thames babies, neighbors who reported seeing Amelia dispose of mysterious parcels. Each piece of evidence added another nail to a coffin already thoroughly sealed. The defense called character witnesses who testified that Amelia had once been kind and charitable, that she'd helped people in her community, that she'd been a devoted mother to her own children. But these testimonies rang hollow against the mountain of evidence, proving she'd murdered hundreds of other people's children. The trial lasted 5 days, though the outcome was never in doubt. On May 26th, the jury retired to deliberate. They returned in just 4.5 minutes, one of the shortest deliberations in Old Bailey history. The foreman stood, his face grave. How do you find the defendant on the charge of murder? Guilty, my lord. The judge, Mr. Justice Hawkins, placed the black cap on his head, the traditional symbol that a death sentence was about to be pronounced. The courtroom fell absolutely silent. Even those who had come expecting this verdict felt the gravity of the moment. A woman was about to be sentenced to death, and regardless of her crimes, the formality of judicial execution carried a terrible weight. Amelia Dyer, the judge intoned, you have been convicted of murder most foul. You betrayed the trust of desperate mothers. You profited from their suffering. You took innocent lives with casual cruelty over many years. The law allows only one sentence for such crimes. He paused, looking directly at her. You will be taken from this place to a lawful prison, and from there to a place of execution, where you will be hanged by the neck until you are dead. May God have mercy upon your soul. Amelia showed no reaction. She stood perfectly still, her face expressionless, as if the sentence had been passed on someone else. Guards led her from the dock, and she walked steadily, her head held high, maintaining dignity even in condemnation. Whatever remorse she might have felt, she showed none to the public that had come to watch her fall. Outside the Old Bailey, crowds cheered the verdict. Newspapers rushed to print special editions announcing the conviction. Street vendors sold pamphlets detailing the crimes. The trial had become a national obsession, a morality play about justice prevailing over evil. But beneath the celebration lay uncomfortable questions that few wanted to address. What's your take on this case? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, because the next mystery is already ticking. The trial had convicted Amelia Dyer, but it hadn't addressed the system that had enabled her. The desperate mothers who had no legal options. The social stigma that made illegitimate children unmarketable. The economic pressures that drove women to abandon their babies. The willful blindness of a society that knew baby farming existed but chose not to investigate until bodies literally floated to the surface. Amelia Dyer was a monster, but she was a monster that Victorian England had created, fed, and sheltered. Her execution would provide catharsis and closure, but it wouldn't solve the underlying problems that had made her crimes possible in the first place. The trial was over. Justice, such as it was, had been served, but the reckoning for British society was only beginning. June 10th, 1896. Newgate Prison, London. At 9 o'clock in the morning, Amelia Dyer was led from her cell to the execution chamber. She had spent her final 2 weeks in prayer, attended by the prison chaplain, writing letters to family members that oscillated between remorse and self-justification. In her last letter to her daughter Polly, she wrote, I have nothing to say. I have no doubt my sentence is just, but I hope that in the future better provision will be made for these poor children. Even in her final hours, Amelia framed herself as part of a larger social problem rather than its architect. She acknowledged guilt while deflecting responsibility, a pattern she'd maintained throughout her arrest, trial, and imprisonment. The executioner, James Billington, prepared the noose with professional efficiency. He had hanged dozens of criminals, but later told colleagues that Amelia Dyer disturbed him more than any other, not because she showed fear, but because she showed nothing at all. No terror, no remorse, no humanity. She approached death with the same cold detachment she'd brought to murder. At 9 a.m. precisely, the trapdoor opened. Amelia Dyer dropped through, her neck snapping instantly. Death was instantaneous. The woman who had strangled hundreds of babies with white tape died by the same method, strangulation by rope. The symmetry wasn't lost on the crowd gathered outside the prison walls. When the black flag was raised, signaling the execution had been carried out, a cheer erupted from the hundreds who had assembled to mark the moment. But Amelia's death didn't end the story. If anything, it marked the beginning of a painful national reckoning with questions Britain had avoided for too long. The newspapers, which had covered the trial with sensational enthusiasm, now turned their attention to the broader crisis of baby farming. Investigative journalists began documenting similar cases across the country. The British Medical Journal published a scathing editorial estimating that thousands of infants disappeared into the baby farming system annually, with mortality rates approaching 90% in some operations. The Children's Society, a charity organization, conducted surveys revealing that illegitimate infant mortality was 3 times higher than legitimate infant mortality, and much of the difference could be attributed to baby farming. Parliament came under intense pressure to act. Members received letters from constituents demanding legal reforms. Women's organizations, charity groups, and medical societies all called for legislation addressing the baby farming crisis. The public outcry was deafening, driven by a mixture of genuine compassion and Victorian moral panic. Society wanted to save babies while simultaneously punishing fallen women, a contradiction that would shape the legislative response. The first significant reform came in 1897 with amendments to the Infant Life Protection Act. The original 1872 Act had required baby farmers to register with local authorities, but enforcement had been practically non-existent and penalties were minimal. The new legislation strengthened registration requirements, mandated regular inspections of premises where infants were kept, and increased penalties for violations. Baby farmers now faced potential imprisonment rather than mere fines. But the 1897 reforms addressed symptoms rather than causes. They made baby farming more difficult, but didn't eliminate the desperation that drove mothers to seek such services. Illegitimate children remained social pariahs. Unwed mothers still faced economic ruin and social ostracism. The underlying crisis persisted even as the most egregious criminal operations were shut down. The real breakthrough came in 1926 with the Adoption of Children Act, Britain's first comprehensive adoption law. Before this legislation, adoption existed in a legal gray zone, informal arrangements with no official status or protection. The 1926 Act created a formal legal framework for adoption, establishing court procedures, parental rights, and child welfare standards. For the first time, mothers could legally transfer parental rights to adoptive families, with court oversight, ensuring the child's welfare. The path from Amelia Dyer's execution to the 1926 Act was neither straight nor simple. It required 30 years of advocacy, political maneuvering, and gradual social change. But Dyer's crimes had planted a seed that eventually bore legislative fruit. Her murders had forced Victorian England to acknowledge that its moral rigidity was literally killing babies, and that acknowledgement slowly transformed into meaningful reform. The impact extended beyond legislation. Medical professionals began advocating for better maternal health services and support for unmarried mothers. Charities established homes where pregnant women could give birth safely and receive counseling about their options. Social workers developed placement systems that matched adoptive families with children in need. These weren't perfect solutions. Prejudice against illegitimate children persisted well into the 20th century, but they represented genuine progress. Yet even as reforms took hold, the baby farming system didn't disappear overnight. Police continued uncovering cases of child murder disguised as adoption services. In 1902, Annie Walters and Amelia Satch were executed for baby farming murders in London. In 1907, Rhoda Willis was convicted of killing infants in Cardiff. These cases received less publicity than Dyer's trial, but followed the same pattern. Desperate mothers, false promises, collected premiums, murdered babies. Each case prompted renewed calls for enforcement of existing laws and passage of stronger protections. The process was frustratingly slow, hindered by Victorian attitudes about illegitimacy, poverty, and women's roles. Many politicians and social leaders believed that making life too easy for unwed mothers would encourage immoral behavior. Better to maintain some hardship as deterrent, even if that hardship occasionally resulted in dead babies. This calculus seems monstrous from a modern perspective, but it reflected prevailing attitudes of the era. For the mothers who had given their babies to Amelia Dyer, the reforms came too late. Evelina Marmon never fully recovered from learning that her daughter Doris had been murdered. She left her position in Cheltenham and disappeared from public records, presumably trying to build a new life somewhere her past wouldn't follow. Other mothers experienced similar trajectories. Some descended into poverty and alcoholism. Some found redemption through charitable work with unwanted children. Some simply buried their grief and never spoke of their lost babies again. The societal shame surrounding illegitimacy meant these women suffered in silence. They couldn't seek sympathy or support without revealing their own fallen status. They carried the dual burden of grief for murdered children and guilt for having placed those children in danger. Victorian morality blamed them as much as it blamed Amelia Dyer, a cruel judgment that compounded their suffering. Some mothers attempted to find justice through civil suits, seeking compensation for fraud if not acknowledgement of their loss. These efforts typically failed. Courts were unsympathetic to women who had voluntarily given up their children, regardless of the circumstances. The legal system that had so efficiently executed Amelia Dyer showed little interest in providing restitution or recognition to her victims' mothers. The detective work that led to Dyer's conviction also had lasting impact. The Thames Valley Police developed new investigative techniques for tracking criminals who operated under multiple identities. The methodical evidence gathering, the cross-referencing of correspondence, the forensic examination of crime scenes. These became standard practices. Detective Anderson received commendations for his work and was promoted, though he reportedly never spoke publicly about the case after testifying at trial. The psychological toll of investigating such extensive child murder marked him permanently. The house at 276 Piggott Road was demolished in 1897, but its location became infamous. For decades afterward, residents of Reading knew the address and its history. Parents used it as a cautionary tale, warning children away from strangers who made generous promises. The site eventually became a small park, unmarked and unremarkable, its dark history slowly forgotten by all but local historians. In death, Amelia Dyer achieved a perverse immortality. Criminologists studied her methods and psychology. True crime writers chronicled her murders. Social historians analyzed her crimes as symptoms of Victorian dysfunction. She became a symbol of female criminality, of the baby farming crisis, of the dark underbelly of respectable society. Her name became synonymous with a particular kind of predatory evil, the monster hiding behind maternal warmth. But perhaps the most important legacy was the one she could never have imagined. Her crimes catalyzed changes that saved countless lives. The adoption reforms, the child welfare standards, the maternal support services, all emerged partly from the national trauma of confronting what she had done. Thousands of children who might otherwise have died in baby farming operations instead found legitimate adoptive homes or received proper care. Thousands of mothers who might have been driven to desperation instead received support and options. This doesn't redeem Amelia Dyer's crimes or minimize the suffering she caused. It simply acknowledges that even from tremendous evil, some good can emerge if society chooses to learn rather than simply condemn. Victorian England could have executed Amelia Dyer and changed nothing. Instead, it used her crimes as a mirror, seeing reflected there its own failures and hypocrisies, and slowly, painfully, began to change. The babies in the Thames were never forgotten. Memorial services were held, though most victims remained unidentified and were buried in paupers' graves. Religious organizations commissioned plaques remembering the unnamed children who died in the baby farming crisis. These memorials still exist in some locations, weathered stone reminders of a dark chapter in British history. By the 1930s, the worst of the baby farming crisis had passed. Improved adoption laws, better maternal support, and changing social attitudes meant fewer women faced the desperate circumstances that had driven them to Amelia Dyer's door. Child welfare had become a recognized social priority rather than a private family matter. The transformation wasn't complete. Prejudice and inequality persisted, but the systematic murder of unwanted infants had largely been eliminated. Amelia Dyer's execution solved nothing by itself, but the conversation her crimes forced, the reforms her murders catalyzed, the social changes her trial accelerated. These mattered. Justice isn't only about punishing perpetrators. It's also about protecting future victims, about building systems that prevent crime rather than merely reacting to it. In that sense, the aftermath of Amelia Dyer's crimes represents one of Victorian England's better moments, when horror prompted reform rather than simply revenge. More than a century has passed since Amelia Dyer climbed the steps to the gallows at Newgate Prison. The Victorian world that created her has vanished, the rigid moral codes, the grinding poverty, the social structures that made unwanted babies a crisis rather than a challenge. Modern Britain bears little resemblance to the empire that watched her trial with fascinated horror. Yet her story refuses to fade into comfortable historical distance. In the archives of the Thames Valley Police, boxes of evidence from the Dyer case remain preserved. Letters from desperate mothers, tiny garments recovered from crime scenes, photographs of crime scene locations long since redeveloped. These artifacts occasionally emerge from museum exhibitions or academic research, each viewing prompting fresh waves of disgust and disbelief. How could this have happened? How could society have allowed it? How could one woman have murdered so many for so long? The questions are easier to ask from our temporal distance than they were to answer in the moment. Victorian England wasn't uniquely evil or uniquely blind. It was simply a society whose values created specific vulnerabilities, whose moral rigidity produced predictable casualties. Amelia Dyer exploited those vulnerabilities with ruthless efficiency, but she didn't create them. She was the inevitable product of a system that valued reputation over compassion, that punished poverty as moral failure, that offered desperate women no legitimate options while condemning them for choosing illegitimate ones. Modern criminologists who study Amelia Dyer struggle to classify her. She doesn't fit neatly into typical serial killer profiles. She showed no sexual sadism, no apparent psychological compulsion to kill, no evidence of the chaotic thinking that characterizes many multiple murderers. Instead, she was methodical, organized, and primarily motivated by profit. She killed because it was economically rational within her chosen profession, not because of psychological demons or uncontrollable urges. This makes her, in some ways, more disturbing than the stereotypical serial killer. A person driven by compulsion can be understood as sick, mentally ill, broken. But Amelia Dyer was sane by any meaningful legal or medical standard. She understood exactly what she was doing. She knew it was wrong. She simply didn't care, because the financial benefits outweighed any moral qualms. Her crimes were business decisions, calculated with the same cold rationality a merchant might apply to inventory management. Psychologists have suggested various diagnoses in retrospect: antisocial personality disorder, psychopathy, extreme narcissism. These labels attempt to explain the inexplicable, to categorize behavior so far outside normal human experience that it defies easy understanding. But perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that Amelia Dyer wasn't fundamentally different from anyone else. Perhaps she was simply someone who, faced with economic pressure and opportunity, made choices that most people would reject, and then continued making those choices until murder became routine. The mothers who gave their babies to Amelia Dyer have largely vanished from history. Most left no records beyond their letters in her files. They disappeared back into the anonymous masses of Victorian working class, carrying their grief and guilt in silence. A few became advocates for reform, channeling their loss into activism that contributed to legislative change. But most simply tried to forget, to move forward, to survive in a society that offered them no sympathy and little support. Their stories deserve remembering as much as Amelia's. These were women trapped by circumstances not of their making, servant girls seduced by employers who faced no consequences, factory workers abandoned by lovers, women raped and then blamed for their own assaults. Victorian morality blamed them entirely, while exonerating the men who had impregnated them. Society forced them into impossible choices, and then condemned them for making those choices. They were victims twice over, once of the circumstances that created their desperation, again of the monster who exploited it. The babies themselves left almost no trace. Most were never named in official records. Their births weren't registered. Their deaths weren't properly recorded. Their lives passed unmarked by any bureaucratic or social acknowledgement. They existed in a legal and social void, unwanted and unacknowledged, murdered and forgotten. The memorial services held in the aftermath of Amelia's trial attempted to rectify this absence, to give collective recognition to children who never received individual recognition. But these ceremonies were performative rather than substantive, society mourning in general terms, while maintaining the same attitudes that made such deaths possible. In Reading, where much of Amelia's final killing spree occurred, her story has become local legend. Tour guides mention her when walking past the location where Piggott Road once stood. Ghost story enthusiasts claim the Thames is haunted by the spirits of murdered babies. True crime podcasts periodically rediscover her case, presenting it to new audiences with the same mixture of horror and fascination that gripped Victorian newspaper readers. This enduring interest reveals something about human psychology, our need to confront evil while maintaining distance from it. Amelia Dyer becomes a monster in historical costume, safely contained in the past, someone we can judge without implicating ourselves. We tell ourselves we would never have been so blind, never have allowed such crimes, never have created a society where baby farming thrived. The comfortable certainty of hindsight lets us feel superior to our Victorian predecessors. But are we so different? Modern societies still struggle with unwanted children, though the mechanisms have changed. Abortion remains controversial and restricted in many jurisdictions. Adoption systems remain imperfect, with children languishing in foster care, while would-be adoptive parents navigate bureaucratic mazes. Poverty still drives desperate choices. Stigma still attaches to certain kinds of motherhood. The specifics have changed, but the underlying tensions between individual needs and social expectations, between moral ideals and practical realities, remain. Consider the parallels in contemporary human trafficking, where vulnerable people are promised better lives and instead find exploitation or death. Consider illegal adoption markets, where children are sold to wealthy families through fraudulent or coercive means. Consider the ongoing crisis of missing and exploited children worldwide. The forms change, but the fundamental dynamics, desperation, exploitation, society's selective blindness, echo across centuries. Amelia Dyer's body was buried in an unmarked grave within the walls of Newgate Prison, as was standard practice for executed criminals. When the prison was demolished in 1902, the burial ground was disturbed, and remains were reinterred in various locations. No one knows exactly where Amelia Dyer's bones ended up. There's a grim appropriateness to this. She denied her victims proper burials and named graves, and she received the same anonymity in death. The white tape she used became a macabre artifact of Victorian crime history. Samples preserved as evidence occasionally appear in museum exhibitions about criminal justice or Victorian social history. Visitors stare at these innocuous-looking strips of fabric, trying to reconcile their ordinary appearance with the extraordinary evil they facilitated. The tape represents the banality of her evil, not exotic implements of torture, but common household items repurposed for murder. In academic circles, the Amelia Dyer case remains significant for multiple disciplines. Criminologists study her methods and psychology. Social historians analyze her crimes as symptoms of Victorian dysfunction. Legal scholars examine her trial as a milestone in criminal justice. Women's study scholars explore the gender dimensions of both her crimes and society's response. Each perspective reveals different facets of a complex story that resists simple interpretation. Perhaps the most important legacy is the one least tangible, the gradual recognition that protecting children requires more than punishing those who harm them. It requires addressing the social conditions that make children vulnerable, supporting families in crisis, providing alternatives to desperation. The reforms that followed Amelia Dyer's execution embodied this understanding, however imperfectly. Victorian England learned, slowly and painfully, that you can't prosecute your way out of social problems. You have to change the conditions that create those problems. This lesson remains relevant. Modern societies still face choices about how to protect vulnerable populations, how to balance moral judgments with practical support, how to address root causes rather than merely punishing symptoms. Amelia Dyer's story offers no easy answers, but it poses essential questions about responsibility, individual and collective, personal and systemic. The Thames still flows through Reading, past the location where bargemen once pulled small packages from its dark waters. The river has given up other secrets since then, other crimes, other tragedies, other stories of human darkness. But it remembers the babies, if rivers can be said to remember. The water that carried their small bodies downstream still flows to the sea, continuing its eternal journey, indifferent to human suffering but complicit in revealing it. On quiet mornings, when mist rises from the water and the modern city sleeps, you can stand on the riverbank where Victorian policemen once searched for evidence. The view has changed completely. New bridges, new buildings, new boats. But the water itself remains, connecting past to present, carrying the weight of history in its currents. Somewhere beneath the surface, in the silt and stones, traces of the past remain. Fragments of fabric, pieces of brick, memories dissolved into the river's depths. What's your take on this case? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, because the next mystery is already ticking. Amelia Dyer killed between 200 and 400 babies over a 30-year career. She died on the gallows in 1896. These are the facts, preserved in court records and newspaper archives, indisputable and horrifying. But facts alone don't capture the full weight of her crimes. The grief of mothers who trusted her, the terror of babies who died at her hands, the societal failures that enabled her, the reforms or murders eventually catalyzed. History doesn't offer neat resolutions. It offers only the messy, complicated truth of human behavior in specific contexts. Amelia Dyer was a monster, but she was a monster created by Victorian England's contradictions and cruelties. Her victims deserved better options, better support, better protection. Their deaths eventually helped create those better systems, though the price paid for that progress was unconscionably high. The babies in the Thames are gone, their names mostly forgotten, their lives reduced to historical footnotes. But they mattered. Each was a unique human being whose life was stolen before it truly began. Each represented potential unrealized, love unoffered, futures unwritten. They deserve to be remembered not as statistics in a true crime story, but as individuals who suffered and died because the society that should have protected them chose instead to look away. Amelia Dyer's name endures in infamy. But perhaps more importantly, the changes her crimes helped catalyze endure in laws still on the books, in child welfare systems still protecting vulnerable children, in social attitudes that have evolved to recognize that protecting children requires supporting their mothers. The angel maker is dead, but the angels she killed are not entirely forgotten. Their legacy lives in every child protected by systems built on lessons learned from Victorian horrors. The clock has stopped for Amelia Dyer and her victims. But for society, the clock keeps ticking, measuring progress and setbacks, recording our ongoing struggle to create systems that protect the vulnerable rather than exploit them. The case is closed, but its lessons remain eternally relevant. Because human nature hasn't changed, and the capacity for both cruelty and compassion continues to shape the world we build together.